Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. We need to establish something from the outset. The cults we're examining tonight were never meant to provide comfort. They offer no salvation, promise no paradise, guarantee no acknowledgement from the entities they serve. These are organizations built around a theological principle that should be impossible: the worship of gods who neither know nor care that worship exists. Howard Phillips Lovecraft constructed these cults between 1917 and 1937, embedding them within what appeared to be scholarly apparatus: footnotes, cross-references, invented archaeological records. His innovation wasn't the concept of dangerous religious movements. Mystery cults, Gnostic sects, and occult societies had populated weird fiction for decades. What Lovecraft engineered was something philosophically distinct. His cults don't serve evil gods, they serve indifferent ones. Their devotion is cosmically futile before it begins. This creates a peculiar problem for analysis. We can examine the literary construction, trace the historical influences, catalog the manifestations across decades of derivative work. But underneath the academic exercise lies something genuinely unsettling. These fictional cults have generated real ones. The Necronomicon, invented as narrative device, is now sold as grimoire. People claim to practice these rites. The boundary between literary analysis and instruction manual has proven disturbingly porous. Howard Phillips Lovecraft approached religion as an anthropological phenomenon rather than spiritual truth. Born in 1890 to a family whose mental stability would progressively collapse, he rejected theistic comfort by age 5. This wasn't teenage rebellion. It was philosophical conclusion reached through his grandfather's library, through astronomy texts that rendered Earth microscopically insignificant, through his own rationalist temperament, confronting a universe of scale. By the time he began writing supernatural fiction in 1917, his atheism had calcified into something more specific: cosmicism, the position that humanity occupies no privileged place in the universe's hierarchy. The cults he constructed between 1917 and 1937 emerged from this philosophical foundation. Traditional supernatural fiction of the period, the ghost stories of M.R. James, the occult detective tales of Algernon Blackwood, the decadent horrors of Arthur Machen, operated within recognizable moral frameworks. Evil existed, it could be opposed. Lovecraft engineered something conceptually different. His cults worship entities that render the entire moral binary meaningless. Cthulhu doesn't hate humanity. Azathoth doesn't scheme against us. They exist in scales of time and purpose where human concerns don't register. The cultists aren't deluded. They've simply recognized their own insignificance with unusual clarity. Consider the historical moment. The Great War had concluded in 1918, having mechanized slaughter on industrial scale. The Victorian certainties, progress, empire, rational order, had produced trench warfare and mustard gas. Lovecraft was writing in the 1920s and early 1930s, as anthropology and comparative mythology undermined cultural uniqueness. Fraser's The Golden Bough suggested all religions followed predictable patterns. Freud located religious impulse in neurosis. The Lost Generation writers were producing literature of disillusionment. Into this context, Lovecraft inserted cults that don't even pretend transcendence might exist. His correspondence reveals the deliberate construction. In letters to fellow writers, he outlined his philosophical position with remarkable clarity. Humanity represents a momentary and insignificant phenomenon in the life of one of the smaller planets. Our entire history, all our civilizations and conflicts and artistic achievements constitutes background noise in cosmic terms. Traditional religion offered comfort through meaning, divine plans, souls, afterlives, moral structure. Lovecraft's fictional cults offer only accurate perspective. You worship because you've glimpsed the truth of your own irrelevance. The worship itself changes nothing. This created what we might call theological horror, not fear of damnation, but recognition that damnation would require you to matter enough to damn. The cultists in Lovecraft's stories pursue forbidden knowledge, perform elaborate rituals, sacrifice to their gods. None of it registers. The entities they serve remain fundamentally indifferent. The horror isn't that you might anger the gods, it's that you can't. You're beneath their notice even when you're trying to capture their attention. The period's occult revival movements provided structural templates. Theosophy, Golden Dawn rituals, Aleister Crowley's theatrical magical systems. These offered organizational models and liturgical language Lovecraft could invert. Where theosophy promised spiritual evolution toward cosmic consciousness, Lovecraft's cults offered devolution toward cosmic truth. The wisdom they pursued destroyed rather than elevated. The entities they contacted brought madness rather than enlightenment. He was systematically inverting every comfort religion traditionally provided, while maintaining enough ritual structure to feel authentically cultic. What Lovecraft engineered, then, wasn't simply scary stories about evil cults. He constructed a theological position, cosmicism, and built the cults as its inevitable religious expression. If the universe truly contains no inherent meaning, no privileged position for human consciousness, no divine plan, then what would authentic worship of reality itself look like? It would look like cultists serving indifferent gods, pursuing knowledge that destroys comprehension, waiting for returns that promise only our obsolescence. The cults represent atheism's dark mirror, not the absence of gods, but the presence of gods who render us cosmically irrelevant. This philosophical foundation would prove disturbingly durable. The specific stories would be forgotten by mainstream culture. The cults would endure. Lovecraft didn't invent the dangerous cult from whole cloth. He synthesized existing traditions, historical models, and contemporary anxieties into something that felt both ancient and modern. The mystery cults of antiquity provided structural blueprints. Eleusinian mysteries, Dionysian rites, Mithraic initiations. These operated through hierarchical revelation, esoteric knowledge, and ceremonies closed to outsiders. Participants progressed through degrees of initiation, each level revealing truths supposedly too dangerous or sacred for common understanding. Lovecraft borrowed this architecture wholesale. His cults likewise feature inner circles who possess genuine knowledge, outer circles kept deliberately ignorant, and initiation rites that transform rather than merely educate. The Gnostic traditions offered something philosophically closer to what Lovecraft needed. 2nd and 3rd century Gnostic sects proposed that the material world was created not by the supreme deity, but by a lesser, flawed entity, the demiurge. Existence itself represented imprisonment in matter. Salvation required secret knowledge, gnosis, that revealed reality's true horror. You were trapped in a creation ruled by an ignorant or malevolent craftsman. This theological pessimism resonates through Lovecraft's cosmology. His entities aren't the supreme powers. Azathoth, Yog-Sothoth, even Cthulhu exist within hierarchies they didn't create. The cultists seek gnosis that reveals not how to transcend reality, but how cosmically doomed reality has always been. 19th century Orientalism shaped how Lovecraft imagined cult practices reaching Western protagonists. The Victorian fascination with Eastern mysticism. Theosophies borrowed Hindu concepts, translations of Buddhist texts, archaeological discoveries in Egypt and Mesopotamia, created a cultural conviction that ancient, non-Western traditions possessed dangerous wisdom the rational West had safely forgotten. This was pure colonial anxiety disguised as fascination. Lovecraft, despite never traveling beyond his narrow geographic range, absorbed these attitudes completely. His cults often feature non-Western elements, chants in unknown languages, idols of disturbing geometry, practices that violate Western rational categories. The racism embedded in this construction is undeniable. The primitive and the alien collapse into each other. Cultists are frequently described using language that codes racial otherness as spiritual corruption. Fraser's The Golden Bough, published in multiple editions between 1890 and 1915, gave Lovecraft the comparative methodology he needed. Fraser argued that religious practices across cultures followed predictable patterns: fertility rites, sacrifice cycles, dying and rising gods. This suggested religion wasn't divine revelation, but anthropological constant. Humanity invented gods to explain what it couldn't understand. For Lovecraft, this became raw material. If all religions share structural similarities, then his fictional cults could borrow from multiple traditions while serving entities that predate human religious impulse entirely. The chants sound ancient because they are older than human language, pre-human utterances his cultists approximate without comprehension. The decadent movement of late 19th century literature provided aesthetic templates. Joris Karl Huysmans' La Basse, 1891, featured black masses, inverted Catholic ritual, and spiritual corruption pursued as aesthetic experience. The decadents treated transgression as artistic project. Lovecraft strips away the aestheticism. His cultists don't pursue corruption for pleasure or artistic experience. They pursue truth, and the truth happens to be corrupting. This makes them more disturbing than Huysmans' Satan worshippers. Satanists rebel against God. Lovecraft's cultists recognize there's nothing to rebel against. They're not inverting meaning. They're acknowledging its absence. Nietzsche's proclamation that God is dead haunts Lovecraft's project, though likely through cultural osmosis rather than direct engagement. Nietzsche meant this as observation about meaning's collapse in modernity, and as challenge. What do we do now? Lovecraft provides one answer. Into the void left by dead gods, we project new ones, and discover they were there all along, utterly indifferent to whether we worshipped the convenient fictions or finally noticed them. The cultists are post-Nietzschean figures who've accepted that meaning is constructed, then chosen to construct meaning around entities that obliterate all human-scaled meaning. It's theological suicide performed with full awareness. Early 20th century immigration anxieties permeate Lovecraft's cult descriptions in ways he never acknowledged but couldn't suppress. The cultists are frequently immigrants, ethnic minorities, people from communities Lovecraft considered racially inferior. The Call of Cthulhu explicitly describes the Louisiana cult as composed of mongrels. This isn't incidental texture. For Lovecraft, spiritual contamination and racial contamination were linked concepts. The dangerous cults come from outside, bringing alien practices that corrupt white rationality. This racism is foundational to how his cults function in the original stories. Later writers would have to actively decontaminate these elements, recognizing that cosmic horror and xenophobic horror aren't identical even when Lovecraft fused them. What Lovecraft synthesized from these disparate sources was structurally familiar. mystery religions with hierarchical knowledge, but philosophically novel. The knowledge destroys. The hierarchy leads nowhere. The ancient practices serve something genuinely alien rather than merely foreign. He built cults that feel archaeologically plausible while being theologically impossible. They worship what cannot and will not acknowledge worship. Everything that follows stems from this contradiction. The names themselves resist the mouth. Azathoth, Nyarlathotep, Shub-Niggurath, Yog-Sothoth. These aren't words that slip easily into pronunciation. They catch in the throat, require conscious effort, force the speaker to slow down and deliberately form sounds that don't follow English phonetic patterns. Lovecraft engineered this difficulty intentionally. In his essay, Notes on Writing Weird Fiction, he emphasized the importance of names that suggest languages developed under different evolutionary pressures, by vocal apparatus not quite human. The names should feel pre-human or post-human. Linguistic artifacts from consciousness that didn't evolve through the same biological constraints that shaped Indo-European language, families. This serves theological function beyond mere atmosphere. If these entities predate humanity, if they exist across dimensional boundaries, human perception barely registers, then their names shouldn't be pronounceable by human vocal structure. The cultists approximate. They produce sounds that might be pale echoes of the actual designations, which might themselves be merely human, comprehensible translations of something operating in frequencies or modalities we lack organs to perceive. The famous chant from The Call of Cthulhu, Panglui Magluanaf, Cthulhu Relie Gahnagal Ftagan, reads like language that has degraded through transmission across species barriers. Lovecraft provides the translation. In his house at Relie, dead Cthulhu waits dreaming. The English is clear. The original remains deliberately opaque. The distinction between outer gods and great old ones establishes cosmic hierarchy. The terminology appears inconsistently across Lovecraft's work, and later, writers would systematize what Lovecraft left fluid. Generally, the outer gods occupy the highest tier, Azathoth at the universe's center, Yog-Sothoth coterminous with all space-time, Nyarlathotep serving as their messenger and soul. These aren't beings in any conventional sense. They're closer to cosmic principles given minimal agency. The great old ones, Cthulhu most prominently, represent a lower order, still vastly beyond human scale, still indifferent to human existence, but more localized. Cthulhu sleeps in Aurelia. He has a location. He can theoretically be interacted with, even if that interaction proves fatal to human psychology. The cultists worship across this hierarchy, sometimes addressing the immediate and accessible, Cthulhu, sometimes attempting contact with forces so abstract they lack personality entirely, Azathoth. What does it mean to worship something fundamentally indifferent? The cult terminology Lovecraft employs suggests recognition rather than supplication. Cultists don't pray for intervention. They acknowledge existence. They wait for returns. They position themselves as witnesses to events that would occur regardless of human attention. The ritual language throughout Lovecraft's work emphasizes cycles, alignments, times when the stars are right. This isn't divine will, it's cosmic mechanics. The entities will return when astronomical and dimensional conditions permit, regardless of whether cults prepare the way or not. The cultists are cargo cult participants waiting for something that might arrive on schedule, having nothing to do with their efforts. The grimoires provide another layer of linguistic horror. The Necronomicon, supposedly written by the mad Arab Abdul al-Hazred, in 730 CE, serves as the primary forbidden text. Lovecraft invented this completely. He was 15 when he first referenced it in a letter, creating an imaginary book before he'd written the stories that would make it central. Other texts followed: the Pennacotic manuscripts, the Book of Eibon, the Unaussprechlichen Kulten, meaning nameless cults, attributed to the fictional German author Friedrich von Junst. These aren't spell books in the traditional fantasy sense. They're cosmological texts. They contain astronomical data, dimensional mathematics, historical records of pre-human civilizations. The danger isn't casting spells, it's comprehension. Understanding what these books actually describe destroys the reader's ability to function within consensus reality. The symbolic geometry throughout cult descriptions functions as theological statement. Non-Euclidean architecture appears repeatedly, angles that shouldn't exist in three-dimensional space, dimensions that fold impossibly, structures that hurt to perceive. R'lyeh, Cthulhu's city, is described with geometric vocabulary: cyclopean, abnormal, angles that violate rationality. This isn't decorative weirdness, it's mathematical theology. If these entities exist partially outside our dimensional framework, their architecture would necessarily violate our geometric assumptions. The cultists who build approximations of this architecture, or who uncover archaeological remnants, are attempting to create sacred space using sacred mathematics. The geometry itself becomes liturgical language, expressing relationships that can't be captured in words or conventional symbols. Color takes on synesthetic significance in cult contexts. When Lovecraft describes cult ceremonies, he frequently employs color in ways that suggest perception breaking down. The color out of space in his story of that name represents something that exists outside the visible spectrum humans can process. Cultists witness colors that shouldn't exist, that the eye registers but the brain can't categorize. This extends the linguistic problem into pure perception. If the entities operate in sensory dimensions we don't possess, encountering them would produce sensory data. We lack categories to process. The cultists experience this as madness, not because they're insane, but because sanity requires stable categories, and stable categories require a reality that behaves consistently. Names themselves become contagion. Speaking the names of the outer gods aloud is treated throughout Lovecraft's work as performative rather than merely descriptive. You're not just referencing them. You're potentially creating resonance, drawing attention, opening channels. This reflects medieval and Renaissance magical traditions, where demons' true names granted power over them, except inverted. Speaking Yog-Sothoth's name doesn't give you power over Yog-Sothoth. It might give Yog-Sothoth awareness of you, which proves catastrophically worse. The cultists know the names. They use them in ritual, but even they hedge with titles and epithets. The crawling chaos, the black goat of the woods with 1,000 young, the lurker at the threshold. These deflections suggest that even those who've devoted themselves to worship recognize some names are too dangerous to pronounce without preparation. The linguistic architecture Lovecraft built, unpronounceable names, hierarchical terminology, grimoires as cosmic revelation, geometric language, color beyond perception, creates cults that communicate in registers humans can't quite achieve. The cultists are linguistic approximators, speaking sounds and building shapes that gesture toward realities they glimpse but never fully grasp. The language itself becomes evidence of the theological claim. These are not gods we invented. These are forces we're struggling to describe with tools evolution didn't prepare us to wield. Every cultist chant is admission of inadequacy. Every ritual name is mistranslation. And that's as close to the truth as human language permits. Lovecraft understood that fictional mythology gains power through apparent historicity. His stories don't present themselves as pure invention. They masquerade as recovered documents, scholarly reports, anthropological case studies, journalistic investigations. The Call of Cthulhu frames itself as posthumous publication of Professor Angel's research notes, which themselves compile police reports, newspaper clippings, sailor testimony, and archaeological findings. The reader approaches the cult not as fictional construct, but as discovered phenomenon, pieced together from fragmentary evidence that supposedly predates the narrator's attempt to synthesize it. This technique, what we might call cosmic authenticity, operates through specific formal strategies. Lovecraft employed footnotes referencing books that don't exist. He cited page numbers from the Necronomicon. He provided dates for when Abdul al-Hazred supposedly wrote it, when it was translated into Greek, when Pope Gregory IX ordered it burned in 1232. These details serve no narrative purpose in the traditional sense. The plot doesn't require knowing the Necronomicon was translated by Theodorus Philetas. But the scholarly apparatus creates illusion of depth, suggesting these stories occupy a larger historical framework the reader is only glimpsing partially. The shared universe strategy amplified this effect exponentially. When Lovecraft's correspondents, Robert E. Howard, Clark Ashton Smith, Robert Bloch, August Derleth, began referencing each other's invented entities and texts, they created cross-validation that mimicked academic citation. Howard's story mentions the Necronomicon. Smith's story references Tsathoggua, whom Lovecraft then incorporates. Lovecraft mentions the Book of Eibon, which Smith had invented. This wasn't collaboration in the conventional sense. It was conspiracy. Each story that referenced another writer's invention made the entire framework feel more archaeologically real. If multiple independent sources reference the Cthulhu cult, the reader's pattern-seeking mind treats it as corroboration rather than coordination. Real, locations anchored the supernatural elements. Lovecraft set his cults in Providence, Rhode Island, in Newburyport, Massachusetts, thinly disguised as Innsmouth, in New Orleans. Readers could visit these places. The Louisiana Bayou cult, in the Call of Cthulhu, operates in topography anyone could verify. This grounding technique makes the impossible elements more credible through proximity to the verifiable. The reader knows Louisiana exists, knows the bayou geography, can imagine police raids into remote swamp communities. The cult practices become plausible extensions of confirmed reality rather than pure fantasy. Lovecraft inverted the usual relationship between text and world. Most fantasy builds worlds to support stories. Lovecraft built stories to support texts. The Necronomicon matters more than any individual plot. The accumulated references to Cthulhu across multiple stories matter more than the Call of Cthulhu itself. He was constructing an archaeological layer beneath his fiction, a stratum of grimoires, cult histories, pre-human civilizations that his stories would merely sample. This created what Jorge Luis Borges, who admired Lovecraft, called the contamination of reality by dream. The books bleed outward from the stories into the world. The epistolary and documentary evidence strategy reinforced this contamination. Lovecraft frequently structured stories as letters discovered after the writer's death or madness. The Whisperer in Darkness consists largely of correspondence between an academic and a Vermont farmer, with photographs included as evidence. At the Mountains of Madness reads as Scientific Expedition Report. The Shadow over Innsmouth frames as personal testimony, followed by newspaper accounts of a government raid. These formats position the reader as investigator rather than audience. You're not being told a story. You're examining primary sources, drawing your own conclusions, conducting research into something that supposedly occurred before you arrived. The cult practices Lovecraft described emerged from genuine research mixed with calculated invention. He read anthropological accounts. He studied medieval witch trial records. He absorbed theosophical literature, despite dismissing it intellectually. When he described cultists drumming and piping in worship of Azathoth, he was borrowing from accounts of ecstatic religious practices across multiple cultures, shamanic trance states, Dionysian rites, whirling dervishes. When he detailed the bas-relief sculptures in The Call of Cthulhu, he was extrapolating from actual archaeological discoveries being reported in the 1920s. The cults feel researched because they were, even though the entities they worshipped were entirely fabricated. Why did readers want to believe? The appeal of secret histories operates on deep psychological levels. The idea that beneath consensus reality lies a hidden framework. Ancient cults, suppressed knowledge. Truths, too, dangerous for public disclosure, satisfies pattern-seeking impulses while providing narrative that elevates the believer. If you know about the Cthulhu cult, you possess information others lack. You've seen through the comfortable surface to darker truth. This is conspiracy theory psychology before the term existed. Lovecraft engineered stories that positioned readers as insiders to forbidden knowledge, creating the same seductive dynamic his fictional cults used on their members. The early fan communities around Lovecraft's work treated the mythos as collaborative world-building rather than pure fiction, but with significant blurring of that boundary. The Lovecraft Circle, his network of correspondents and fellow writers, knew they were inventing these elements. They discussed the invention explicitly in letters. Yet they also treated the accumulated material with quasi-scholarly seriousness, debating which version of the Necronomicon history was correct, arguing about whether Cthulhu was outer god or great old one, compiling concordances and timelines. They were playing a game that resembled scholarship, and the game was sufficiently elaborate that it began generating its own gravity. This created peculiar ontological status for the cults. Within the stories, they're real. Within the Lovecraft Circle's correspondence and collaborative expansion, they're acknowledged fiction, treated with scholarly apparatus. Within the broader readership, they occupied ambiguous space. Some readers understood them as pure invention. Others suspected they might reference actual occult traditions Lovecraft had encoded. Still others, particularly after Lovecraft's death in 1937, when his work began reaching wider audiences, treated them as genuine esoteric knowledge wrapped in fictional packaging. The cults migrated from fiction to folklore to, eventually, claimed practice. August Derleth's posthumous editing and expansion of Lovecraft's work accelerated this process. Derleth published fragments Lovecraft had left incomplete, filled gaps in the mythos, systematized what Lovecraft had kept deliberately vague. He also founded Arkham House, publishing specifically to keep Lovecraft's work in print. This institutional framework, a publishing house dedicated to maintaining and expanding this fictional universe, further legitimized the material. Academic-looking books about fictional cults created the impression of academic subject matter. The bibliography became self-sustaining. By the 1970s, the myth-building had succeeded beyond anything Lovecraft could have anticipated. The Necronomicon was being published as if it were real. Occult practitioners were incorporating Lovecraft's entities into actual magical systems. Role-playing games were creating mechanical rules for how cultists would function. The cults had achieved what Lovecraft's stories suggested they would. They'd contaminated reality itself. Not because ancient entities exist, but because the idea of ancient entities served psychological and cultural functions that ensured transmission. What Lovecraft discovered, perhaps accidentally, was that mythology doesn't require belief to function. It requires only internal consistency and sufficient detail to occupy mental space. His cults feel real because he built them with architectural precision, cross-referenced them obsessively, and grounded them in recognizable geography and scholarly formats. The authenticity was always constructed, but constructed authenticity, given sufficient detail and collaborative reinforcement, becomes functionally indistinguishable from the genuine article. The cults exist now in the same ambiguous space as other urban legends and modern folklore. Not quite believed, but not quite dismissed either. Which is exactly where the most dangerous ideas operate most effectively. Cosmic indifference forms the theological foundation these cults rest upon. Traditional religious structures, whether Western monotheism, Eastern karmic systems, or animist frameworks, presume the universe possesses awareness of human existence. God watches, karma accumulates, spirits respond to offerings. Lovecraft's outer gods operate under fundamentally different parameters. Azathoth writhes at the center of infinity, described as the blind idiot god, surrounded by servitors who pipe and drum mindlessly. This isn't malevolence, it's something conceptually worse, complete unawareness. The cultists who worship Azathoth are performing devotion towards something that cannot register their existence. Their prayers don't go unanswered, they go unheard. The distinction matters. This creates what we might term anti-teleology, the systematic rejection of purpose or direction in cosmic processes. Aristotle proposed that nature acts toward ends, that acorns contain inherent oak tree purpose. Christian theology expanded this into divine plan encompassing all creation. Even naturalistic evolution, despite lacking conscious design, produces apparent purpose through selection pressure. Lovecraft's cosmology strips away even this minimal comfort. The outer gods don't guide universal development. They aren't evolving toward anything. Cthulhu doesn't sleep in Arlaia, awaiting the moment to fulfill some cosmic role. He sleeps because the astronomical conditions that permitted his activity have temporarily shifted. When they shift back, he'll wake. Not because the universe needs him to, simply because the mechanics permit it. The cults therefore worship entropy itself, not metaphorically, but as theological principle. The second law of thermodynamics states that closed systems trend toward disorder, that energy disperses, that structure inevitably dissolves. This physical law becomes religious doctrine. When cultists await Cthulhu's return, or Yog-Sothoth's manifestation, they're anticipating entropy's triumph over the temporary local order that permits human civilization. We exist in a pocket of complexity that will necessarily collapse. The outer gods represent that collapse personified, or rather depersonified, given form but not intention, presence but not purpose. Worshipping them means aligning yourself with heat death, acknowledging that dissolution is the only genuine cosmic constant. Hierarchies of insignificance structure the cult cosmology in ways that compound the horror. It's not simply that humans are insignificant to the outer gods. The outer gods themselves occupy positions within hierarchies they didn't create and cannot escape. Nyarlathotep, described as soul and messenger of the outer gods, serves Azathoth despite possessing vastly more consciousness and agency. Azathoth itself, though positioned at cosmic center, lacks awareness of its own centrality. Even at the top of this hierarchy, there's no transcendent consciousness, no ultimate meaning maker. The cults worship upward through layers of indifference, each entity insignificant to whatever might exist above it, with no summit where significance is finally achieved. It's insignificance all the way up. This generates peculiar epistemological problems for cultists seeking knowledge from these entities. What does it mean to pursue wisdom from sources that don't possess wisdom in any human recognizable sense? The grimoires supposedly contain truths revealed by or about the outer gods. But if these entities lack intentionality, they can't reveal anything purposefully. The knowledge must be extracted, interpreted from astronomical data, dimensional mathematics, the physical traces their existence leaves. The cultists aren't receiving divine revelation. They're conducting archaeology on cosmic indifference, finding patterns in what might be mere residue rather than communication. The knowledge destroys because it's accurate, not because it's forbidden by jealous gods, but because human psychology cannot accommodate these truths without structural collapse. Time functions in cult cosmology as enemy rather than river. The Call of Cthulhu emphasizes cycles, when the stars are right. This astronomical precision suggests time operates as mechanical constraint rather than narrative progression. Cthulhu isn't waiting for humanity to reach moral readiness or technological capacity. He's waiting for galactic rotation to return specific stellar configurations that permit dimensional permeability. Human history, all our civilizations, all our development, occurs in the gaps between these cycles. We exist in cosmic downtime. When the cycles complete, our existence becomes irrelevant to whatever transpires next. The cults mark time according to these inhuman calendars, tracking stellar positions that matter infinitely more than human chronology. The dream reality collapse appears throughout Lovecraft's cult stories as both metaphor and literal mechanism. In The Call of Cthulhu, sensitive individuals worldwide experience identical nightmares during Cthulhu's brief stirring. The dreams aren't symbolic representations. They're direct psychic contact with something pushing against dimensional barriers. This suggests consciousness itself operates as threshold space where different realities interpenetrate. The cultists don't distinguish sharply between waking and dreaming states because, from the outer god's perspective, both might be equally ephemeral. If our entire consensus reality represents one localized dimensional configuration among infinite others, then dreams might access configurations equally valid. The cultists operate in these threshold states, treating visions as data and reality as negotiable. Madness serves as epistemological gateway throughout these cult structures. This isn't madness as disease or delusion. It's madness as adaptation to accurate perception. Human sanity requires certain base assumptions, that reality behaves consistently, that the self maintains continuity, that time flows unidirectionally, that three-dimensional space exhausts physical possibility. Encountering the outer gods, or comprehending what the grimoires actually describe, violates all these assumptions simultaneously. The mind breaks not because it's weak, but because it's operating correctly. attempting to process sensory and conceptual input. Its architecture wasn't designed to accommodate. The cultists who retain functionality after genuine contact have achieved what Lovecraft calls cosmic outlook. They've reconfigured their psychological architecture to accommodate truths that destroy standard consciousness. Whether this represents enlightenment or simply functional insanity remains deliberately ambiguous. Perhaps there's no meaningful distinction once you've seen clearly enough. Azathoth occupies the cosmological center, described across Lovecraft's work as the blind idiot god who bubbles and blasphemes at the universe's core. This is deity stripped of every attribute theology traditionally requires. No consciousness, no intention, no awareness of being worshipped. The entity exists as pure chaotic principle, described in The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath, as mindless ruler attended by demon flute players who pipe monotonously in unison. The cults that form around Azathoth worship entropy made manifest. Their rituals involve drumming and piping that mimics the cosmic cacophony supposedly emanating from infinity's center. They're not communicating with Azathoth. They're harmonizing with it, aligning their activities with ultimate meaninglessness. The theological implication here becomes genuinely unsettling. If consciousness emerged from unconscious process, and Azathoth represents that process deified, then awareness itself might be cosmic accident rather than inevitable development. The cultists recognize this. Their devotion isn't to power or wisdom, but to the primordial chaos from which order temporarily emerges before inevitable dissolution. Some texts suggest Azathoth's awakening would Thoth's end reality itself, not through active destruction, but through cessation of the unconscious dreaming that maintains existence. The cults thus function as entropy worshippers awaiting heat death, treating apocalypse as return to natural state rather than catastrophic deviation. Nyarlathotep operates under entirely different parameters, the only outer god who appears to possess genuine malevolent intention toward humanity. Described as the crawling chaos and soul and messenger of the outer gods, Nyarlathotep actively manipulates human cultists, while other entities remain indifferent. In Lovecraft's prose, poem Nyarlathotep, the entity appears as traveling showman in 1920s America, demonstrating terrible technologies and driving audiences to madness and violence. This isn't cosmic indifference. It's cruel attention. The entity notices humanity specifically to torment us. The cults surrounding Nyarlathotep therefore differ structurally from other outer god worship. These aren't humans imposing meaning on indifferent forces. These are humans being deliberately cultivated, manipulated, used as instruments for purposes they cannot comprehend. Nyarlathotep appears in various forms, sometimes humanoid, sometimes amorphous horror, suggesting shape-shifting capacity or existence across multiple dimensional configurations simultaneously. The cultists serve as his cat's paws, a phrase Lovecraft uses explicitly. They think they're pursuing forbidden knowledge or cosmic power. They're actually being played with by something that finds human suffering entertaining. This introduces genuine evil into otherwise amoral cosmology, making Nyarlathotep perhaps the most dangerous entity to worship, precisely because he might actually care that you're worshiping and enjoy what that worship enables him to accomplish. Shub-Niggurath, invoked repeatedly as the black goat of the woods with 1,000 young, represents fertility horror, reproduction as cosmic contamination. The entity appears primarily through its offspring, creatures that spread across Earth like invasive species. The cults devoted to Shub-Niggurath practice fertility rites inverted into something monstrous. They're not celebrating life's renewal. They're facilitating proliferation of alien biology that corrupts terrestrial genetics. The 1,000 Young suggests unlimited reproductive capacity, life generating life without constraint or purpose. Fertility is cancer rather than blessing. This entity particularly reveals Lovecraft's anxieties about heredity and bloodline. His stories frequently feature characters discovering they possess non-human ancestry, that their family lines have been contaminated through cult-arranged breeding. The Dunwich Horror centers entirely on this theme, a family deliberately interbreeding with Yog-Sothoth to produce hybrid offspring. Shub-Niggurath worship extends this into fertility cult territory, with rituals designed to enable cross-species reproduction. The theological principle here treats biological boundaries as artificial constraints to be dissolved. The cultists don't worship life. They worship life's capacity to mutate, hybrid, and transform beyond recognition. This is evolution as horror, not adaptive progression, but genomic chaos. Yog-Sothoth receives perhaps the most philosophically complex treatment, described as coterminous with all time and space, yet somehow locked outside our dimensional framework. The Dunwich Horror provides the key passage. Yog-Sothoth knows the gate. Yog-Sothoth is the gate. Yog-Sothoth is the key and guardian of the gate. This suggests entity functioning as dimensional threshold itself, not separate from the mechanism that connects realities, but identical with it. The cultists seeking contact with Yog-Sothoth aren't worshipping a being in conventional sense. They're attempting to manipulate dimensional topology. The Dunwich cult specifically attempted to breed with this entity, producing Wilbur Whately and his invisible twin. These offspring represent living dimensional violations, biological impossibilities that nonetheless exist. The cult's goal extended beyond mere worship. They sought to open permanent gates, allowing the outer gods unrestricted access to Earth's dimensional frequency. This makes Yog-Sothoth cults uniquely apocalyptic. Where Cthulhu cultists await their god's return, Yog-Sothoth cultists actively work to restructure reality's fundamental architecture. They're not preparing for invasion. They're attempting to eliminate the boundary that currently prevents it. Lesser entities populate the hierarchy with specialized cult followings. Cthulhu himself, despite prominence in popular culture, functions as Great Old One rather than Outer God, significant distinction suggesting limited rather than cosmic scope. He sleeps in Arlier, will wake when conditions permit, commands cult following worldwide, but he's localized, defeatable temporarily, bound by astronomical constraints. The cults still function predictably, global distribution, dream communication, waiting for stellar alignment. In his house at R'lyeh, dead Cthulhu waits dreaming. The most famous line in Lovecraft's corpus suggests patience rather than power, dormancy rather than dominance. Hastur receives mentions primarily through other authors' elaborations, becoming associated with Carcosa and the King in Yellow through Robert Chambers' influence on Lovecraft's circle. Tsathoggua, contributed by Clark Ashton Smith, represents toad god worshipped in Hyperborean times, with cults continuing into the present. Each entity accumulates specific ritual practices, specific cult structures, specific forms of worship adapted to their particular nature. But underlying all these variations runs consistent theme. The entities don't need worship, don't benefit from it, may not notice it occurs. The cultists worship anyway. This transforms religious devotion into something closer to compulsion, not spiritual practice, but psychological symptom of having glimpsed cosmic truth. Human minds weren't designed to accommodate. The question persists across all cult variations. Do these entities desire worship, or have cultists imposed meaning on indifference? Lovecraft deliberately leaves this unresolved. Some stories suggest genuine communication, others imply projection. The ambiguity itself generates horror. If the gods are real and indifferent, worship is futile. If they're hallucinated, cultists have destroyed themselves, serving nothing. Either possibility leads to same conclusion. The worship produces no salvation, no transcendence, no reward. Only the slow realization that devotion to cosmic indifference might be humanity's most honest theological position, and that honesty destroys us. Why do humans join these cults at all? The stories provide consistent answers. Promised knowledge, offered power, pledged immortality. All lies, or rather, truths that prove worse than lies. The Call of Cthulhu describes cultists who believe they'll rule alongside their god when he wakes. The Dunwich Horror features the Whately family convinced their hybrid offspring will grant them cosmic significance. The seduction operates through humanity's foundational weakness, the conviction that we can matter, that our actions carry weight, that understanding grants control. The outer gods offer none of these things, but the cults present convincing illusions until initiation advances far enough that retreat becomes impossible. The transformation of believers proceeds through stages Lovecraft depicts with clinical precision. Initial contact produces fascination. The cultist-to-be encounters strange dreams, reads forbidden passages, hears rumors of power beyond human limitation. This phase feels like discovery, enlightenment's beginning. The second stage introduces physical and psychological alterations. In The Shadow over Innsmouth, this literalizes as genetic transformation. Cult members gradually assume fish-frog hybrid characteristics, their humanity dissolving into something adapted for deep ocean existence. Other stories make the transformation purely mental. Cultists develop the Innsmouth look, even without biological justification, their faces reflecting something changed behind the eyes. The final stage produces what Lovecraft variously calls cosmic outlook, or simply madness indistinguishable from enlightenment. The cultist can no longer function within consensus reality because they've accepted truths that make consensus reality untenable. They see stellar patterns others miss. They hear frequencies normal human perception filters out. They've reconfigured their consciousness to accommodate information evolution never prepared human neurology to process. This isn't delusion. The stories consistently present these altered cultists as seeing accurately. They've simply seen too much. The mind cannot unknow once it's genuinely comprehended the scale at which we're insignificant. Generational cults compound this horror through inherited madness and bloodline contamination. The Marsh family of Innsmouth interbreed with deep ones across generations, each successive generation more hybrid than the last. The Whateleys of Dunwich deliberately conceived children with Yog-Sothoth, producing offspring that barely qualify as human. These aren't isolated choices by individual cultists. They're multi-generational projects where children are born into worship, raised knowing they're meant as sacrifices or breeding stock, or dimensional keys. The question of consent becomes meaningless. You can't consent to being born half human. You can't choose to reject heritage encoded in your genetics. This introduces profound ethical dimensions Lovecraft explores uncomfortably. Is Wilbur Whately villain or victim? He's educated in forbidden lore from childhood, taught his purpose involves opening gates for entities that will render humanity extinct or irrelevant. His twin brother, the invisible, rapidly growing thing confined to the Whately farmhouse, never achieves even Wilbur's limited humanity. These are children weaponized by cult theology, their very existence serving as ritual components. When Wilbur dies attempting to steal the complete Necronomicon from Miskatonic University, his body reveals his true form. Partly human, partly something else entirely. The Watchers react with horror and disgust. But Wilbur didn't design himself. He's the cult's artifact. Hybridization extends beyond literal interbreeding into psychological and spiritual contamination. Cultists describe feeling their consciousness expand, merge with something vaster. The Whisperer in Darkness features this most explicitly. Cult members have their brains surgically removed, placed in cylinders that permit consciousness to survive without biological constraints. They can be transported across stellar distances, experience realities human bodies could never access. The cult promises transcendence. What it delivers is disembodiment. Consciousness stripped of humanity's protective limitations, forced to perceive without the filtering mechanisms that make perception bearable. The seduction of gnosis, knowledge as drug, enlightenment as addiction, runs through every cult structure. Lovecraft understood that information itself can function as weapon. The Necronomicon doesn't teach spells in the conventional fantasy sense. It teaches perspective. It provides astronomical data, dimensional mathematics, historical records of civilizations that rose and fell while humanity's ancestors were still single-celled. Comprehending this doesn't grant power. It destroys the comfortable fictions that make human existence psychologically sustainable. The cultists pursue this knowledge anyway, driven by the same impulse that makes people unable to stop researching disturbing topics once they've started. The knowledge contaminates. Each piece demands the next. The search for understanding becomes compulsion. Cult hierarchies reflect this contamination's progression. Outer circles receive comfortable lies. They're told they'll gain power, knowledge, immortality in comprehensible terms. Inner circles learn the truth gradually. Their God doesn't care. Their sacrifices mean nothing. Their devotion changes nothing about their cosmic irrelevance. The innermost circles have accepted this completely. They worship not despite indifference, but because of it. They've achieved what might be called anti-faith, devotion to entities that render devotion meaningless. This psychological state proves remarkably stable once reached. The fully initiated cultist cannot return to normal human concerns. They've seen the scale. Everything humans care about registers as local, temporary, ultimately futile. They continue cult practices not from hope, but from acceptance that nothing else matters more because nothing matters at all. The question of agency haunts these transformations. Are cultists choosing this path or being subtly compelled? Some stories suggest the entities themselves exert gravitational pull on human consciousness. Cthulhu's dreams spreading worldwide, Nyarlathotep actively manipulating, Yog-Sothoth's offspring inheriting compulsions. Other stories present purely human choice, people who read forbidden books and decided they wanted more, regardless of cost. The ambiguity matters. If compelled, cultists are victims. If choosing, they're collaborators in their own destruction. Lovecraft refuses clean distinction. The entities might exert influence. Humans might be naturally drawn to their own epistemological demolition. Both can be simultaneously true. Archaeological and anthropological encounters provide the framework for many cult stories. Academics stumble across evidence. Carved reliefs, ancient texts, ruins of civilizations that predate human history. They begin researching. The research leads to understanding. Understanding leads to madness, or recruitment, or both. At the Mountains of Madness follows this arc. Antarctic expedition discovers pre-human city, ancient records documenting Earth's true history, evidence that humanity was created accidentally by entities called the Elder Things as livestock or biological experiment. The expedition members who survive and comprehend cannot return to normal academic work. They've learned truths that make all human scholarship seem provincial, studying shadows while missing the structures casting them. This is the cult recruitment pipeline for educated victims. Curiosity becomes contamination, becomes commitment. Madness functions throughout as protective mechanism rather than simply breakdown. When Johansen encounters Cthulhu directly in The Call of Cthulhu, his mind recoils, fragmenting rather than accepting what his senses report. This saves his life. Others who looked too steadily, who tried to comprehend what they witnessed, died immediately, consciousness unable to accommodate the contradiction between evolved expectations and presented reality. The cultists who function after genuine contact have somehow metabolized this contradiction. Their madness permits continued existence where sanity would mean psychological collapse. From certain angle, they're the successfully adapted ones. We call it madness because we still inhabit the comfortable consensus. They've graduated into nightmare clarity that might be cosmically accurate, even if humanly unsustainable. The forbidden texts at the center of cult practice don't contain spells in the conventional fantasy sense. They contain perspective shifts. The Necronomicon's danger isn't that it teaches you to summon demons, but that it teaches you what humanity actually is. Accidental byproduct of pre-human experimentation. Brief flourishing between cosmic cycles. Consciousness that evolved without purpose in a universe that doesn't accommodate purpose. Comprehending this accurately doesn't require ritual invocation. The comprehension itself destroys the psychological architecture that makes human functioning possible. You finish reading. You understand. You can never ununderstand. This is knowledge as mimetic hazard decades before information theory developed terminology for the concept. The performative danger of reading operates at neurological level. Language restructures thought. Reading isn't passive reception, but active reconstruction. Your consciousness temporarily reorganizes itself according to patterns the text establishes. Most texts leave you fundamentally unchanged once you close the book. The grimoires in Lovecraft's cosmology don't permit this return. They're written in languages or employ mathematical frameworks that require your mind to reconfigure in order to parse them. The Pnakotic manuscripts supposedly employ non-Euclidean geometries as linguistic structure. Reading them means training your spatial reasoning to accommodate dimensional relationships that violate three-dimensional constraints. You cannot then revert to processing space normally. The text has rewritten your perceptual apparatus. Mathematical revelations appear throughout these texts as peculiarly dangerous knowledge. The Dreams in the Witch House features Walter Gilman studying non-Euclidean calculus and quantum physics that reveal certain mathematical relationships between our dimension and others. The mathematics itself functions as gateway, not metaphorically, but literally. Understanding the equations permits perception of dimensional architecture normally invisible to human consciousness. This positions mathematics not as human invention, but as discovered structure, objective relationships that exist whether humans comprehend them or not. The cultist mathematician learns formulae that describe reality more accurately than consensus physics permits. The accurate description doesn't make reality more manageable. It makes human consciousness unable to function within reality's actual parameters. Linguistic contamination extends beyond mathematics into pure language systems. Lovecraft repeatedly emphasizes that certain concepts can only be expressed in languages evolution hasn't prepared humans to speak. The Arleahian language Cthulhu's cultists approximate contains phonemes human vocal apparatus struggles to produce. This isn't mere exotic flavor. It suggests thoughts that require linguistic structures our neurology didn't evolve to support. Learning these languages doesn't just add vocabulary. It potentially restructures the cognitive architecture that produces thought itself. Some concepts might be unthinkable in English, thinkable only in languages designed by or for non-human consciousness. The cultists who pursue this linguistic knowledge risk rewriting their own minds into configurations that can no longer interface with human culture. The chain of contamination, one text leading inevitably to another, appears consistently across Lovecraft's work. You read a reference in a legitimate historical document. It mentions a forbidden book. Curiosity drives you to find it. That book references another, even more dangerous. Each text increases your knowledge while decreasing your ability to function within the consensus that denies what you now know. The Shadow Out of Time features this cascade. Academic researching amnesia case discovers library containing all of Earth's history, past and future, maintained by entities who project their consciousness across time. He reads, he learns his amnesia resulted from consciousness swapping with these time-traveling beings. He can never return to normal academic life. The knowledge has made him unemployable, unrelatable, unable to care about research that ignores what he's learned. Academic communities function throughout these stories as unintentional cult transmission vectors. Universities maintain libraries. Libraries contain dangerous books. Academics research dangerous topics. The institutional framework designed to preserve and transmit knowledge becomes mechanism for spreading epistemological contamination. Miskatonic University appears repeatedly in Lovecraft's work as repository for texts that should have been destroyed. The librarians who catalog them, the scholars who study them, the students who stumble across them, all potential cult recruits through purely scholarly channels. This suggests intellectual curiosity itself might be cult recruitment mechanism. The drive to understand, to know, to read further. These impulses that enable science and learning also deliver victims to knowledge that destroys them. The impossibility of unknowing creates the trap. Physical danger, you can flee. Theological threat, you can disbelieve. But epistemological threat operates at level where flight and disbelief aren't options. Once you've comprehended the mathematics that reveal dimensional topology, you cannot stop perceiving dimensions your eyes register, but your previous cognitive framework filtered out. Once you've understood humanity's actual position in cosmic hierarchy, you cannot restore the comfortable fiction of significance. The cultists aren't imprisoned by belief. They're imprisoned by accurate perception. This inverts the usual religious criticism. Typically, we ask whether believers possess actual knowledge or merely faith. Lovecraft's cultists possess actual knowledge and discover that actual knowledge destroys more thoroughly than any illusion could. Forbidden knowledge as mimetic hazard operates through transmission mechanisms Lovecraft intuited before formal study of information contagion existed. Ideas spread. Dangerous ideas spread perhaps more effectively than safe ones because they're memorable, disturbing, difficult to dismiss once encountered. The Necronomicon exists now. not as genuine grimoire, but as cultural object. People have written versions. Publishers sell them. Readers purchase them. The fictional book has generated real books that claim to be it. This is mimetic propagation crossing the fiction-reality boundary. The idea of forbidden knowledge has proven so compelling that people insist on making it real, creating the very contamination vector the fiction warned against. The ethical question hovers over all these considerations. Should some knowledge be suppressed? Lovecraft's stories consistently answer yes, while acknowledging suppression's impossibility. The Call of Cthulhu opens with famous statement, "The most merciful thing in the world, I think, is the inability of the human mind to correlate all its contents. Mercy through ignorance." But the narrator proceeds to correlate, to piece together the cult's global extent, to comprehend what his uncle's research revealed. He publishes this knowledge posthumously, spreading the very contamination he recognizes as dangerous. The compulsion to share, to document, to preserve, proves stronger than recognition that some truths destroy understanding. Modern parallels illuminate why these ideas resonate beyond their period. Information hazards, knowledge that harms the knower, exist in contemporary discourse. Cognitohazards, concepts that damage cognitive function through comprehension alone, populate internet folklore and speculative fiction influenced by Lovecraft. The SCP Foundation Collaborative Fiction Project features extensive catalogs of information that kills through understanding. Roko's Basilisk proposes thought experiment that supposedly becomes more dangerous the more you understand it. These inherit Lovecraft's central insight. Information itself can be weapon, understanding itself can be threat, and human curiosity ensures these weapons will be deployed against ourselves. The cults preserve and transmit this dangerous knowledge because that's their function. They're information storage systems that happen to destroy their users. The grimoires get copied, hidden, rediscovered. The rituals get performed, documented, taught to new initiates. The knowledge spreads not despite its danger, but because of it. Danger makes it worth protecting, worth pursuing, worth transmitting. The forbidden becomes precious through prohibition. The cults thus serve as immune system failure in the body of human knowledge, mechanisms designed to preserve information that continue functioning even when the information preserved proves terminal to the host organism. What Lovecraft engineered through these cult structures was epistemological horror that has proven more durable than his stories' plotting or prose style. The specific plots are often creaky, the purple prose excessive, the racism inexcusable. But the central idea, that some knowledge destroys comprehension, that understanding and sanity might be incompatible, that human consciousness occupies narrow bandwidth of possible awareness and straying outside, that bandwidth proves fatal. This has contaminated horror fiction permanently. Every subsequent cosmic horror story, every tale of forbidden knowledge, every grimoire that kills through reading, traces lineage back to Lovecraft's insight that epistemology itself can be horror's subject. The cultists aren't villains pursuing evil knowledge. They're victims who pursued knowledge honestly and discovered honesty has costs human psychology cannot pay while remaining recognizably human. That's the forbidden knowledge's ultimate revelation. Truth and humanity might be mutually exclusive categories. The cults exist at their intersection, populated by people who chose truth and discovered what it cost them. The cult concept emerged gradually across Lovecraft's work, rather than arriving fully formed in a single story. Nyarlathotep, written in 1920, provides the earliest glimpse. a prose poem describing traveling showman who demonstrates wild electrical displays that drive audiences to madness and violence. The followers form spontaneously, drawn by demonstrations of impossible technology. They're not organized cult yet, more like mass hysteria crystallizing around charismatic figure who might be entity rather than human. The story ends with cosmic apocalypse suggested but not explained, humanity fleeing down a valley illuminated by a sunset of crimson fires. This established template: entity makes contact. Humans respond with worship-adjacent behavior. Civilization collapses. The Nameless City, in 1921, introduces archaeological evidence of pre-human cults. The narrator discovers ruins in Arabian desert, descends into chambers decorated with hieroglyphs depicting reptilian race that worshipped entities from the stars. The city predates humanity entirely. Its builders are long extinct. But their religious structures remain, and the final chamber contains something that drives the narrator fleeing in terror. This story establishes crucial principle. The cults existed before humans evolved consciousness, will presumably continue after humans vanish. We're not the first species to develop religion around these entities. We won't be the last. The festival, published in 1923, presents functional cult continuing into modern period. The narrator receives summons to attend Yuletide ceremony in Kingsport, Massachusetts, discovering his family has participated across generations in rituals honoring entities that predate Christianity's overlay on pagan practice. The cultists descend into cavern systems, ride on backs of hybrid winged things, witness rites the narrator cannot adequately describe. The story deploys folk horror atmosphere, isolated community, inherited practices, seasonal rituals, while introducing cosmic horror elements that make traditional witch cult narratives seem parochial. These aren't devil worshippers. They're serving something older, stranger, incomprehensible to Christian theological categories. The Call of Cthulhu, in 1926, provided the template all subsequent Lovecraft cult stories would reference or modify. The story's documentary structure, academic examining grandfather's notes, which compile police reports, artistic testimonies, sailor journals, creates impression of comprehensive research synthesizing global cult phenomenon. The Louisiana Bayou cult that police raid represents one node in worldwide network. The Greenland raids mentioned in newspaper clippings represent another. The artists and sensitive individuals experiencing synchronized nightmares represent unconscious cult membership, recruited through dreams. The story introduces the chant, the bas-relief sculptures as theological texts, the astronomical waiting for stellar alignments. Every element becomes standard cult feature in subsequent stories. The Dunwich Horror, in 1928, shifted focus from cult organization to cult outcome. The Whately family represents generational cult reduced to single bloodline, isolated in rural Massachusetts, pursuing breeding program with Yog-Sothoth. The story provides more detail about cult methodology than previous works. The specific grimoires consulted, Necronomicon, Book of Ibon, the astronomical calculations required, the rituals performed on Sentinel Hill. When Wilbur Whately dies attempting to steal complete Necronomicon from Miskatonic University, his body reveals his hybrid nature. The story makes explicit what previous stories implied. Cults don't just worship, they facilitate, they breed, they attempt to physically merge with entities they serve. The Whisperer in Darkness from 1931 introduced technological cult dimension. The extraterrestrial fungi from Yog-Sothoth have established operation in rural Vermont. using cultists who've had their brains surgically extracted and placed in cylinders. These preserved consciousnesses can be transported across interstellar distances, experiencing realities human biology could never access. The cult here offers transhumanist transcendence, escape from bodily limitations through surgical intervention that happens to serve alien species harvesting human minds. The story's epistolary format, letters between academic and farmer, photographs provided as evidence, reinforces documentary authenticity while revealing cult operations more sophisticated than primitive ritual worship. The interconnections across these stories created collaborative mythology that felt researched rather than invented. The Call of Cthulhu mentions the Necronomicon. The Dunwich Horror shows characters consulting it. At the Mountains of Madness references it while adding new texts. Each story that referenced another writer's contribution, Robert E. Howard's Unaussprechlichen Kulten, Clark Ashton Smith's Book of Eibon, Robert Bloch's De Vermis Mysteries, strengthened the illusion that these represented genuine occult traditions being documented rather than invented. The Lovecraft Circle correspondence networks functioned as cult in literary form, distributed community sharing forbidden knowledge, cross-referencing each other's work, building comprehensive mythology that no single author controlled. The letters discuss these invented elements with quasi-scholarly seriousness, debating timeline consistency and theological implications. They were world-building collaboratively while maintaining plausible deniability that they believed any of it. The ambiguity, fiction, or folklore was precisely the point. Cults operate in that ambiguous space where belief and performance blur. The Lovecraft Circle was performing cult behavior while studying it, creating feedback loop where the writing and the mythology became inseparable. The Call of Cthulhu established the architectural blueprint every subsequent cosmic horror cult would reference, modify, or subvert. Published in Weird Tales in February 1928, the story opens with what has become Lovecraft's most quoted passage. The most merciful thing in the world, I think, is the inability of the human mind to correlate all its contents. The narrator, Francis Wayland Thurston, has inherited his granduncle's papers and begun correlating what Professor Angel had carefully documented but failed to synthesize completely. The cult reveals itself through accumulation, police reports from Louisiana, dream testimonies from artists worldwide, sailor accounts from Pacific encounters. Each fragment alone seems manageable. Together, they suggest global conspiracy existing beneath official history. The structure itself reinforces cult methodology. Thurston pieces together evidence his granduncle collected: a bas-relief sculpture confiscated during police raid, newspaper clippings about mass hysteria among artists and sensitive individuals, testimony from Norwegian sailor who encountered something in the South Pacific. This documentary approach makes the cult feel discovered rather than invented. We're not being told a story, we're examining evidence, drawing conclusions, conducting investigation that proves increasingly dangerous to mental stability. The form embodies the content. Researching the cult begins to feel like joining it, as knowledge accumulates beyond the point where ignorance remains possible. The Louisiana cult provides ground-level detail. New Orleans police raid swamp ceremony after reports of disappearances and voodoo orgies. What they discover defies their categories. Mixed-race gathering. Lovecraft's racism explicit here. Mongrels from multiple ethnic backgrounds. Performing rites that borrow from multiple traditions without belonging to any. The cultists dance ecstatically, chant in unknown language, sacrifice to idol of indescribable form. When arrested, they speak of Great Cthulhu, who sleeps in R'lyeh, beneath Pacific Ocean, waiting for time when the stars are right to wake and reclaim Earth. The police treat this as delusion. Thurston's research suggests it might be accurate. The bas-relief sculpture functions as theological text rendering abstract doctrine concrete. Created by young sculptor Henry Anthony Wilcox during March 1925 period of disturbed dreams, it depicts creature that violates biological categories. A monster of vaguely anthropoid outline, but with an octopus-like head whose face was a mass of feelers, a scaly, rubbery-looking body, prodigious claws on hind and fore feet, and long, narrow wings behind. This isn't symbolic representation. Lovecraft presents it as portrait, anatomically detailed rendering of entity's actual form. The sculpture becomes cult icon because it accurately depicts what cultists worldwide witness in synchronized dreams. Art here serves religious function, making visible what exists beyond normal perception, providing focus for worship directed at something that resists visualization. The chant, Fanglui Mugulwinaf Cthulhu R'lyeh Wagahnagulftagen, operates as cult's central liturgical formula. Lovecraft provides translation. In his house at R'lyeh, dead Cthulhu waits dreaming. The original language resists English phonetics deliberately. Cultists worldwide chant these syllables despite speaking different native languages, suggesting transmission through dreams rather than cultural contact. This is theology reduced to coordinates and condition. Entity's location, Ar-Laya. Entity's state, dead but dreaming. Entity's activity, waiting. No moral instruction, no divine command. Simply statement of cosmological fact cultists have chosen to orient their worship around. Dream transmission provides the cult's recruitment and coordination mechanism. During brief period in March 1925, sensitive individuals worldwide, artists, poets, architects, experience identical nightmares featuring non-Euclidean cities and winged entities. Some create art from these visions. Others descend into madness. The established cult members recognize this as Cthulhu, stirring briefly in his sleep, psychic pressure, radiating outward as he shifts position in his underwater tomb. The dreams aren't symbolic. They're direct perception of entity pushing against dimensional barriers. Consciousness so vast that its dreams contaminate nearby minds. This makes anyone with sufficient sensitivity potential cult member. You don't choose to worship Cthulhu. You encounter him in dreams and either dismiss the experience or begin researching what you witnessed. Johansson's encounter provides the story's climax, direct observation of entity by someone not seeking it. The Norwegian sailor's yacht encounters recently surfaced R'lyeh in South Pacific, discovers impossible geometry of ancient city, accidentally releases Cthulhu briefly before astronomical conditions force it back into dormancy. Johansson's written account, recovered after his death, describes something his mind struggled to process. A mountain walked or stumbled. The thing cannot be described. There is no language for such abysms of shrieking and immense lunacy, such eldritch contradictions of all matter, force, and cosmic order. The cult worships this. They've oriented their entire religious structure around serving entity, whose form violates comprehension, whose awakening promises nothing but humanity's obsolescence. The story's legacy extends beyond plot into structure. Every found footage horror film, every conspiracy investigation narrative, every story where researcher pieces together dangerous truth from fragmentary evidence, they're inheriting the Call of Cthulhu's framework. The cult itself becomes template, global distribution, dream recruitment, astronomical timing, worship of indifferent entity, knowledge that destroys the knower. Later writers could modify elements, change the entity, alter the ritual practices, shift the geographic locations, but the fundamental architecture remained. Lovecraft had engineered cult structure that felt authentically religious, hierarchies, liturgy, eschatology, while being philosophically novel, cosmic indifference, epistemological horror, futility as theological principle. The story's influence on horror fiction proves nearly as widespread as the cult it describes, contaminating narrative forms and thematic concerns across media for nearly a century. We're still investigating Thurston's correlation, still discovering the price of connecting fragments that were perhaps better left disconnected. The Dunwich Horror, published in Weird Tales in April 1929, shifts cult focus from organization to outcome. What happens when multi-generational worship produces practical results? The Whately family of rural Massachusetts represents cult reduced to single bloodline, isolated in decaying farmhouse, executing breeding program that treats human reproduction as ritual technology. Where The Call of Cthulhu examined cult as distributed network. The Dunwich Horror examines cult as family pathology, hereditary madness codified into religious practice that spans generations. Old Whately, the grandfather patriarch, orchestrates the operation with full awareness of what he's attempting. He studied the grimoires. His library contains Latin Necronomicon, fragments of the Book of Ibon, other texts acquired through channels the story never explains. His daughter Lavinia's pregnancy in 1913 lacks human father. The child, Wilbur Whately, grows at supernatural rate, mature in intelligence by age 3, physically adult by age 10. Lovecraft describes him carefully. Wilbur was not very human-looking. There was something almost goatish or animalistic about the thick, protruding lips. The hybrid nature shows through despite mostly human appearance. He's weapon constructed through biological process, living key designed to open dimensional gates. The invisible twin represents the breeding program's secondary output, something that never achieved even Wilbur's approximation of humanity. Confined to the Whately farmhouse, fed cattle by old Whately, growing rapidly beyond any terrestrial biology's normal scale, it remains hidden until old Whately's death in 1924 removes the one person capable of containing it. Lovecraft uses sound to suggest what sight cannot capture. A kind of half-hoarse crow, mixed with a nasty, inarticulate croaking, a muddy kind of glibber. The twin is cosmic horror as biological specimen, entity that shouldn't exist according to terrestrial evolutionary parameters, but does, proving dimensional barriers can be violated through reproductive technology. Wilbur's education reveals cult knowledge, transmission in detail. Old Whately teaches him languages, Latin, Greek, eventually the pre-human languages required to read Necronomicon in original fragments. He instructs him in astronomy, tracking stellar configurations that matter more than any terrestrial calendar. He explains their purpose. The gates must be opened, allowing Yog-Sothoth and them from outside unrestricted access to Earth's dimensional frequency. This isn't worship seeking favor, it's engineering project treating theology as applied physics. The family understands exactly what they're facilitating. Old Whately's deathbed ravings make this explicit. Open the gates, Yog-Sothoth. The three spaces, the dark priest. Sentinel Hill functions as sacred site and dimensional weak point. The Whateleys conduct their rituals there on Walpurgis night, and other astronomically significant dates. The hill itself predates colonial occupation. Local indigenous traditions supposedly avoided it, recognizing something wrong about the location's topology. This layers colonial horror onto cosmic horror. The Whateleys are white settlers conducting rituals at site whose dangers predate European arrival. The cult appropriates space where dimensional barriers are naturally thinner, exploiting geographic vulnerability for theological purposes. Wilbur's death at Miskatonic University provides the story's turning point. He breaks into the library, attempting to steal complete Latin Necronomicon. The fragments he's studied aren't sufficient for what he's planning. The guard dog attacks. Wilbur falls. As he dies, his clothing tears, revealing his true form. Above the waist, it was semi-anthropomorphic, though its chest had the leathery, reticulated hide of a crocodile or alligator. The back was piebald, with yellow and black, and dimly suggested the squamous covering of certain snakes. Below the waist, though, it was the worst, for here all human resemblance left off, and sheer fantasy began. The description continues. Tentacles, rudimentary eyes on hips, no visible reproductive organs. This is what human outer god hybridization produces. Biological impossibility that nonetheless existed, walked, spoke, studied. The academic's counter-cult intervention introduces resistance possibility. Dr. Armitage, Rice, and Morgan decode Wilbur's diary, understand the threat his invisible twin represents, track it across Dunwich as it grows to house size and beyond. They employ the knowledge against itself, using formulas from the very grimoires the Whateleys consulted to perform banishing ritual. Armitage speaks in a language that no listener there could name or recognize, while the twin thrashes against magical constraint. The ritual succeeds. The entity dies screaming, its form finally visible through chemical spray, something the size of a barn covered in mouths and tentacles, fundamentally wrong in ways that make Wilbur's hybrid nature seem almost human by comparison. The final revelation through spray makes explicit what the story has implied. The twin is what full hybridization produces when humanity's genetic contribution is minimal. It's Yog-Sothoth's offspring with barely any Lavinia Whateley visible in its biology. The cultists, the family, created this intentionally, raising it to adulthood, planning to use it as biological gate opener. The horror isn't that the breeding program failed. It's that it succeeded. The family managed exactly what they intended, producing hybrid entities capable of serving as dimensional bridges. They were stopped this time through academic intervention. But the knowledge remains. The grimoires still exist. Other families, other cults, could attempt the same program using the same texts. The Dunwich horror thus makes cult theology terrifyingly practical. This isn't abstract worship of distant entities. It's applied biology, selective breeding, reproductive horror in service of cosmological goals. The family structure itself becomes cult architecture. Old Whateley as high priest and researcher. Lavinia as ritual participant and breeding stock. Wilbur as hybrid weapon. The twin as successful dimensional violation. Where the Call of Cthulhu suggested cults wait passively for stellar alignments. The Dunwich horror shows cults actively engineering conditions, treating human bodies as raw materials for cosmic outcome. The story reveals what cult dedication looks like across generations. Children raised as sacrifices, knowledge hoarded and transmitted, humanity traded for cosmic significance that proves indistinguishable from human extinction. The Whateleys failed, but they came remarkably close to succeeding. which makes their cult perhaps the most dangerous Lovecraft depicted, not because they worshiped the most powerful entities, but because they understood how to translate worship into practical methodology that nearly worked. August Derleth's posthumous systematization of Lovecraft's mythology represents both preservation and transformation. After Lovecraft's death in 1937, Derleth positioned himself as literary executor and mythos curator. He founded Arkham House specifically to keep Lovecraft's work in print, collaborating with Donald Wandre to publish collections that might otherwise have remained scattered across pulp magazines. But Derleth did more than preserve. He systematized imposing structure Lovecraft had deliberately kept fluid. Where Lovecraft maintained cosmic indifference, Derleth introduced elemental categorization and good versus evil dualism. Hastur became Windwalker, opposed to water-dwelling Cthulhu. The elder gods emerged as benevolent forces opposing the outer gods. This simplified Lovecraft's philosophical complexity into manageable fantasy framework, making the material more accessible while diluting its disturbing implications. The contradiction matters because it reveals tension between popularization and philosophical integrity. Derleth's editions, stories completed from Lovecraft's fragments, new tales set in Lovecraft's universe, reached wider audiences than Lovecraft's lifetime work ever achieved. Arkham House published definitive collections. Fans discovered comprehensive mythology rather than scattered stories. But Derleth's framework suggested cosmic conflict with sides, stakes, possibility of victory. Lovecraft's entities don't oppose each other meaningfully. They simply exist in configurations indifferent to human categorization. The cults in Derleth's editions often become more conventionally evil, serving entities that desire domination rather than entities that render domination meaningless through sheer scale. This made better pulp fantasy, but worse cosmic horror. Robert E. Howard's contributions predated this systematization, operating as genuine collaborative expansion. His invention of the unaussprechlichen Kulten, nameless cults, by German author Friedrich von Junst, provided another grimoire for the growing library. Howard's stories featured Levantine and European cult variations, expanding geographic scope beyond Lovecraft's New England focus. His cults often incorporated more traditional occult elements, witch covens, diabolism, pagan survivals, blended with cosmic horror framework. This enriched the mythology while maintaining Lovecraft's core insight. The entities these cults served predated and would outlast human religious categories entirely. Howard died in 1936, never seeing how extensively his contributions would be integrated into the expanding mythos. Clark Ashton Smith brought aesthetic sophistication Lovecraft's sometimes purple prose lacked. His Hyperborean cycle introduced Tsathoggua, toad god worshipped in prehistoric era, whose cults continued into present day. Smith's prose style, ornate, sensuous, decadent, made cult worship feel aestheticized rather than purely terrifying. His stories often featured sorcerers and scholars who approached forbidden knowledge as connoisseurs rather than victims. This shifted emphasis slightly. Cosmic horror could be appreciated, even enjoyed in perverse way, rather than only endured. The Tsathoggua cult in Smith's The Tale of Satampra Zeros features temple robbers who encounter the entity directly and survive through quick thinking, rather than psychological collapse. Smith's cults remained dangerous, but became navigable by clever protagonists, reducing cosmic indifference slightly toward manageable threat. Robert Bloch contributed both to original mythos and later expansions. His invention of the De Vermis Mysteriis, Mysteries of the Worm, added another grimoire. His stories often featured modern urban settings, cults operating in cities rather than isolated rural communities, contemporary practitioners updating ancient practices. The Shambler from the Stars featured author clearly based on Lovecraft encountering cult and dying from the experience. A metatextual gesture acknowledging the dangerous knowledge transmission. Bloch later wrote psychological horror that influenced different tradition, but his early mythos contributions emphasized how cult practices could adapt to changing cultural contexts without losing essential character. Ramsey Campbell's British localization in the 1960s and 70s demonstrated the mythos's portability. His Severn Valley replaced Lovecraft's Miskatonic Valley. His Goatswood replaced Arkham. The cults in Campbell's stories operated in declining industrial towns, council estates, working-class communities facing economic collapse. This grounded cosmic horror in social realism, suggesting cult recruitment might appeal particularly to populations experiencing material hopelessness. If conventional society offers no prospects, why not pursue cosmic alternatives? Campbell's prose style, more restrained than Lovecraft's, more psychologically focused, made cult membership feel like comprehensible choice rather than purely supernatural imposition. His cultists were people you might meet, facing recognizable problems, who made terrible decisions for understandable reasons. Later literary evolution produced increasingly sophisticated cult portrayals. Brian Lumley's Titus Crow series, beginning in the 1970s, featured organized resistance to cults, occult detective narratives where knowledgeable protagonists actively opposed cult operations using counter-magic. This introduced adventure element largely absent from Lovecraft's work, where investigation typically ended in death or madness. Thomas Ligotti absorbed Lovecraft's philosophy, but applied it to corporate and institutional contexts. His cults operated as theater troupes, puppet shows, business enterprises, everyday structures revealed as servicing cosmic horror through mundane operations. The horror became ambient rather than eruptive, suggesting we might already inhabit cult structures without recognizing them. Laird Barron's 21st century stories blend cosmic horror with noir and rural Americana. His Old Leech entity and associated cult feature multi-generational operations in Alaska and Pacific Northwest, families that have served this entity across centuries. Barron's prose combines Lovecraft's cosmic scope with hard-boiled detective fiction's cynicism, creating cults that feel historically grounded and contemporary simultaneously. His cultists are often wealthy, powerful, embedded in legitimate institutions, suggesting cult membership might be privilege rather than pathology, secret knowledge restricted to elites who can afford the psychological costs. Ruthanna Emrys's Innsmouth Legacy series represents perhaps the most significant recent evolution, stories told from cult perspective. Her novels follow survivors of the Innsmouth raid that concluded The Shadow over Innsmouth, Deep One hybrids attempting to preserve their culture and practice their religion despite government persecution. This inversion transforms Lovecraft's monsters into sympathetic protagonists, his cults into persecuted religious minorities. The cosmic entities remain strange and powerful, but worshipping them becomes identity and heritage rather than corruption. Emrys directly confronts Lovecraft's racism while preserving his cosmic horror framework, demonstrating the concepts can be separated from the xenophobia that originally shaped them. The question of canonicity becomes increasingly meaningless as expansion continues. Lovecraft never intended systematic mythology. His stories contradicted each other, left details deliberately vague, resisted codification. Nyarlathotep's systematization created appearance of canon that never existed. Later writers could either accept Nyarlathotep's framework, return to Lovecraft's ambiguous original texts, or forge their own interpretations. The cults thus exist in quantum superposition, simultaneously defined and undefined, their practices and theologies varying based on which texts you privilege. This might actually enhance their horror. Real mythologies evolve inconsistently across time and geography. Fictional mythology that mimics this inconsistency feels more authentic than one maintained with rigid continuity. The expansion has produced dilution alongside enrichment. The Cthulhu cult appears now in comedies, role-playing games, plush toys, internet memes. Overexposure has domesticated what Lovecraft engineered to disturb. Yet underneath commercial exploitation and popular culture proliferation, the original philosophical horror remains available to readers willing to engage seriously. The cults still offer their central bargain: worship entities that render worship meaningless, pursue knowledge that destroys comprehension, acknowledge cosmic indifference that obliterates human significance. This trade hasn't improved with familiarity. It's simply become easier to avoid taking seriously, which might be exactly what makes it more dangerous. Domestication creates comfort. Comfort makes you vulnerable to ideas you've dismissed as entertainment, suddenly revealing they were never merely entertaining at all. The Necronomicon represents the most successful literary hoax in 20th century horror fiction. Not because anyone orchestrated a hoax, but because readers created one through collective desire for the book to exist. Lovecraft invented it casually in 1922, providing increasingly elaborate backstory across subsequent stories. Written by Mad Arab Abdul al-Hazred in 730 CE, translated into Greek as Necronomicon by Theodorus Philetus, rendered into Latin by Olaus Wormius in 1228, subsequently suppressed by religious authorities with rare copies surviving in restricted library collections. This fictional bibliography gained sufficient detail that readers began treating it as historical reference. By the 1960s, occult bookstores received regular inquiries. Library catalogs were searched. People wanted to believe forbidden knowledge existed in accessible form, if only they could locate the right restricted collection. The Simon Necronomicon, published in 1977, capitalized on this desire. Presented as translation of genuine ancient text, it blended Sumerian mythology, Lovecraftian references, and ceremonial magic practices into grimoire that claimed authenticity despite being obvious pastiche. It became a cult bestseller anyway. Readers knew Lovecraft invented the Necronomicon. They purchased Simon's version regardless, treating it as functional substitute. If the real Necronomicon didn't exist, this approximation might serve similar purposes. This created peculiar situation. Fake book based on fictional book being used in actual magical practices by practitioners who understood its fictional origins but found it effective regardless. The book's power derived not from ancient authority, but from cultural weight of Lovecraft's mythos, proving grimoires function through belief rather than historical authenticity. Other published versions followed, each claiming different approach to authenticity. The Hay Necronomicon, 1981, presented itself as scholarly reconstruction. George Hay commissioned Colin Wilson and Robert Turner to create version based on Lovecraft's scattered references. This acknowledged fictional status openly, while providing completest satisfaction. What would the Necronomicon contain if it existed? The result resembled academic commentary on non-existent text, metafictional exercise that some readers nonetheless treated as magical reference. The multiplicity of versions itself became feature rather than bug. Real grimoires exist in multiple translations and editions. The Necronomicon, by generating competing versions, mimicked genuine manuscript tradition. The Starry Wisdom Church demonstrates how fictional cults generate tourist economies. Lovecraft set this cult in Providence, Rhode Island, his hometown, with headquarters supposedly at Federal Hills Benefit Street. The church appeared in The Haunter of the Dark, worshipping entity Nyarlathotep through shining trapezohedron, crystalline artifact that permits seeing across dimensions. No actual Starry Wisdom Church existed, yet Providence now markets its Lovecraft connections. Walking tours identify buildings that inspired fictional locations. Fans photograph churches Lovecraft might have referenced. The tourism board embraces cosmic horror as local color, creating economic infrastructure around cults that never existed, serving gods that were always invention. Modern religious groups have adopted the name, knowing its fictional origins, finding the cosmic horror framework spiritually meaningful anyway. The Church of Starry Wisdom, registered as actual religious organization in various jurisdictions, practices rituals drawn from Lovecraft's fiction, blended with chaos magic, and left-hand path occultism. Members understand they're enacting fiction. They find that enactment produces genuine spiritual experience. This dissolves the boundary between fiction and practice in ways Lovecraft never anticipated, but that his work's themes almost invite. If meaning is constructed rather than discovered, if gods exist through belief rather than ontological independence, then fictional gods believed sufficiently become functionally real. Innsmouth tourism has transformed Newburyport, Massachusetts into pilgrimage, site for horror fans. Lovecraft based Innsmouth on this coastal town, describing it as decaying port where families interbred with deep ones, gradually transforming into fish-frog hybrids destined to join submarine city of Yahan-Thully. The story ends with government raid destroying the cult and bombing Devil Reef. Newburyport embraces this dark tourism. Local businesses reference the story. Annual festivals celebrate cosmic horror. Visitors joke about Innsmouth look while photographing colonial architecture Lovecraft described. The town has become its own fictional double, real location haunted by imaginary history more commercially valuable than actual past. The slippage between fiction, folklore, and claimed reality accelerates in internet age. Forums discuss Necronomicon acquisition as though logistical problem rather than ontological impossibility. Creepypasta communities write collaborative horror, treating Lovecraftian entities as real within narrative frame while operating in spaces where frame's boundaries deliberately blur. The SCP Foundation, collaborative writing project cataloging fictional anomalies, inherits Lovecraft's technique of using clinical documentation to make impossible seem researched. Entries reference Lovecraft's entities, expanding their mythology while maintaining pseudo-scientific framing that mimics Foundation reports securing genuine threats. This is myth-making operating at internet speed, cult documentation as Creative Commons project. True crime parallels emerge uncomfortably. Actual cults, Heaven's Gate awaiting spacecraft, Aum Shinrikyo releasing sarin gas in Tokyo subway, Solar Temple conducting mass suicide, display structural similarities to Lovecraft's fictional versions despite no direct influence. They await cosmic events. They possess hierarchical knowledge. They treat human life as expendable compared to cosmological purpose. Lovecraft was documenting pattern, not inventing it. The fictional cults feel authentic because they're extrapolating from genuine cult psychology. the seduction of secret knowledge, the comfort of cosmic purpose even when that purpose involves your obsolescence, the social reinforcement that makes impossible beliefs sustainable. The Manson family's apocalyptic race war prophecies, Heaven's Gate's convictions about extraterrestrial salvation, Aum Shinrikyo's attempts to accelerate world-ending conflict, all display cosmic horror's central dynamic. They've glimpsed reality they cannot accommodate within normal frameworks, constructed mythology to make sense of what they've seen, and organized around serving forces they believe transcend human categories. Whether the forces exist objectively or only in believers' minds makes less practical difference than we'd prefer. Film has struggled with Lovecraftian cults more consistently than it's succeeded. Early adaptations, Roger Corman's Die, Monster, Die, 1965. Daniel Haller's The Dunwich Horror, 1970, attempted translating cosmic horror into visual medium by making everything explicit. The 1970 Dunwich featured Dean Stockwell as Wilbur Whately, conducting psychedelic rituals with hippie cult aesthetics, chanting over prone women in what plays as exploitation film rather than cosmic horror. The problem these films discovered, showing the entities and making cult practices explicit, removes the epistemological uncertainty that makes Lovecraft's cults disturbing. When you see the monster clearly, when you understand exactly what the ritual accomplishes, the cosmic indifference becomes manageable threat rather than existential vertigo. In the Mouth of Madness, 1994, succeeded by making the cult metafictional. John Carpenter's film features author Sutter Kane, whose horror novels cause readers to lose grip on reality, forming cults that worship entities from the books. The protagonist investigates Kane's disappearance, discovers New England town where fiction and reality have merged, where Kane serves as prophet for genuine cosmic entities using fiction as recruitment tool. The film's final revelation, that the protagonist's investigation is itself fiction within fiction, that audiences watching the film are reading Kane's work and becoming contaminated, replicates Lovecraft's strategy. The cult isn't contained within the story. It extends through the story into reader-jar-viewer consciousness. The film acknowledges what Lovecraft intuited. Horror fiction about dangerous ideas can become dangerous ideas' transmission mechanism. Dagon, 2001, Stuart Gordon's Spanish production, provided most faithful cult portrayal in film adaptation. Set in coastal fishing village, where Dagon worship has replaced Catholicism, the film shows cult integration into daily life. Everyone participates. The priests conduct services that blend Christian liturgy with pre-human worship. The congregation transforms gradually across generations into Deep One hybrids. The protagonist discovers his own. Heritage connects to the cult. He's not investigating from outside, but being drawn back to community he belonged to, genealogically, if not consciously. The film's body horror emphasizes transformation's physicality, skin becoming scales, fingers webbing, facial structure shifting. This makes cult membership biological destiny rather than choice, exploring Lovecraft's most disturbing implication, that some contaminations become hereditary. Gaming provided the medium where Lovecraftian cults thrived most successfully. Call of Cthulhu RPG, first published by Chaosium in 1981, made cult investigation the core gameplay loop. Players create investigators, academics, journalists, private detectives, who encounter cults and gradually lose sanity through exposure to cosmic truth. The sanity mechanic quantifies Lovecraft's insight. Understanding and mental stability inversely correlate. See too much, comprehend too clearly, and your character becomes unplayable. The game's published. Scenarios detail cult operations extensively, organizational structures, ritual practices, recruitment methods, theological justifications. This transforms Lovecraft's vague suggestions into mechanical precision, providing cult documentation more comprehensive than any single story contained. Video games inherited these mechanics while adding visual and interactive dimensions. Bloodborne, 2015, features healing church cult that appears benevolent, healing sick, maintaining order, while actually facilitating humanity's transformation into something post-human through communion with cosmic entities. The game's insight mechanic literalizes epistemological horror. Accumulate enough insight and you perceive enemies previously invisible. Reality's structure changes. You cannot return to comfortable ignorance. The cult succeeded in their goal. The player arrives after transformation is mostly complete, investigating religion that already won. This inverts usual narrative. You're not stopping cult from succeeding, but discovering they succeeded generations ago, and what appears as normal civilization is already post-cult reality. Cultist Simulator, 2018, approached from opposite angle. You play as the cultist. The game presents a cult investigation as card-based resource management. You balance mundane employment with forbidden research, recruit followers, perform rituals, pursue ascension through dangerous knowledge. The game makes explicit what Lovecraft implied. Cult operation requires logistics. You need money, time, connections, texts, assistants. The mystical knowledge comes wrapped in tedious practical requirements. This demystification becomes its own horror. The cosmic entities remain distant, possibly non-existent. You're managing cult infrastructure without clear evidence that what you worship deserves worship. The game captures the mundane dedication cosmic horror requires. Years of effort, relationships sacrificed, sanity eroded incrementally, all for transformation that might be delusion or might be transcendence, and the game refuses to resolve which. Music's relationship to Lovecraftian cults operates primarily through metal subgenres. Metallica's The Call of Cthulhu, instrumental, 1984, and The Thing That Should Not Be, 1986, brought cosmic horror into thrash metal, the latter explicitly describing Cthulhu, immortal, insane, thing that should not be. Death metal and black metal bands adopted Lovecraftian imagery extensively, band names referencing entities, album art depicting cults, lyrics describing rituals. This works because metal already explored transgression, darkness, rejection of Christian frameworks. Lovecraft's cults provided alternative mythology, worship directed not at Satan, but at entities that make Satan seem parochially human. The H.P. Lovecraft Historical Society created comedic but researched musical adaptations, including a Shoggoth on the Roof, Lovecraftian Fiddler on the Roof, and a very scary Solstice holiday album. These demonstrate how thoroughly Lovecraft's cults have penetrated popular culture. They can sustain parody because audiences recognize the source material. The comedy works through juxtaposition, familiar forms, Broadway musicals, Christmas carols, corrupted by cosmic horror content. Yet underneath the humor runs genuine appreciation for the source material's structure. To parody cult effectively, you must understand cult psychology, ritual function, theological premises. The parody becomes documentation through different medium. Neo-folk and dark ambient music scenes approach Lovecraft more seriously, creating soundscapes meant to evoke cult atmospheres. Artists like Atrium Carceri, Cryo Chamber Collective, and various ritual ambient projects compose hours-long pieces suggesting ancient ceremonies, non-human languages, dimensional threshold spaces. This music functions almost as soundtrack to Lovecraft's fiction, providing auditory textures the stories describe but cannot directly deliver. Listeners report using these soundscapes during Lovecraftian RPG sessions, creating immersive environments where the cult's presence becomes ambient rather than merely described. The music makes the atmospherics real in ways text struggles to achieve, proving sonic environment can conjure dread as effectively as narrative description. The adaptations across media reveal what elements translate successfully. Visual media struggles when showing too much, but succeeds when maintaining ambiguity through implication, perspective distortion, or metafictional frame. Games succeed by making investigation and transformation mechanical, quantifying what prose kept vague, providing rules that paradoxically make the arbitrary feel systematic. Music succeeds through atmosphere rather than narrative, evoking cult presence without requiring explanation. Each medium discovers different aspects of Lovecraft's cult's work effectively in adaptation. None fully captures what the prose achieves: the slow accumulation of detail, the documentary framing, the sense of research contaminating the researcher. But collectively, the adaptations demonstrate these cults function across media because they're addressing something that exists prior to any specific medium: the human susceptibility to organizing our insignificance into worship patterns, even when, especially when, that worship acknowledges its own futility. Actual occult practitioners incorporating Lovecraft's entities into magical systems creates peculiar theological situation, worshipping gods explicitly invented as fiction. Kenneth Grant's Typhonian Order, offshoot of Aleister Crowley's Ordo Templi Orientis, integrated Lovecraftian entities into ceremonial magic framework beginning in the 1970s. Grant proposed that Lovecraft accessed genuine occult realities through creative imagination, that the outer gods represented legitimate magical forces Lovecraft channeled unknowingly. By this mean, books, The Magical Revival, Aleister Crowley and the Hidden God, Night Side of Eden, treat Cthulhu, Yog-Sothoth, and Nyarlathotep as entities equivalent to traditional demons and angels, providing ritual instructions for invocation. This wasn't parody. Grant's system operated as serious magical practice, with initiates performing these rites. The philosophical justification becomes more sophisticated than simple fiction belief confusion. Chaos magic, developed in the 1970s-80s by Peter Carroll and others, operates on principle that belief itself generates magical efficacy regardless of objective truth. From this perspective, fictional entities become valid magical targets because sufficient cultural investment has charged them with psychic energy. Lovecraft's gods exist as thought forms, ideas that have accumulated enough attention, fear, and fascination to function autonomously. Worshipping them produces effects not because they're cosmically real, but because they're culturally real, embedded in collective consciousness deeply enough to serve as magical interfaces. This treats fiction as technology for generating entities rather than barrier to their existence. Modern Satanism generally avoided Lovecraftian elements, and the reason reveals interesting theological distinction. Anton LaVey's Church of Satan and subsequent iterations treat Satan as symbol of individualism, rebellion, human agency. Satanism is fundamentally humanistic, celebrating human desires, human power, human freedom from divine constraint. Lovecraft's entities offer none of this. They render human agency meaningless, rebellion impossible, freedom irrelevant through cosmic indifference. Worshipping them provides no empowerment, no liberation, no satisfaction of human will. From satanic perspective, they're worse than Christian God, at least God cares enough to oppose you. The outer gods don't notice whether you rebel or submit. This makes them theologically useless for left-hand path traditions, seeking empowerment through transgression. Gothic and horror subcultures embraced Lovecraftian cult aesthetics more superficially but more broadly. Conventions feature cosplayers as cultists, complete with hooded robes, non-Euclidean jewelry, fake Necronomicons as props. LARP, live-action roleplay, communities run elaborate scenarios where participants enact cult operations, investigation, ritual, transformation. These operate as play, theater, communal storytelling. Yet the boundary between playing cult member and researching cult psychology blurs productively. To roleplay cultist convincingly requires understanding cult appeal, why someone would join, what progression from skeptic to believer might feel like, how group dynamics reinforce individually untenable beliefs. The play becomes method acting that occasionally produces genuine insights into cult psychology. Academic study has intensified as Lovecraft's literary reputation improved. Literary scholars analyze cult structures as narrative devices, how the documentary framing creates verisimilitude, how the global distribution suggests conspiracy, how the futility of worship generates philosophical horror. Michel Houellebecq's critical study, H.P. Lovecraft, Against the World, Against Life, 1991, English 2005, positioned Lovecraft as philosopher of cosmic pessimism, whose cults embody authentic response to materialist universe. Houellebecq argues Lovecraft's horror stems from taking Darwinism and cosmology seriously. If we're accidental byproducts of meaningless process, then Cthulhu cults represent honest theology, where Christianity represents comforting delusion. Religious studies scholars examine Lovecraftian cults through comparative methodology. They function structurally like Gnostic sects, hierarchical knowledge, material reality as prison, salvation through gnosis that reveals reality's horror. They resemble millenarian movements, awaiting cosmic event that transforms everything. Preparatory, rituals, chosen community aware of what's coming. They echo mystery cults, initiatory degrees, esoteric symbols, experiences that separate initiated from uninitiated. This academic analysis reveals Lovecraft synthesized genuine religious patterns, making his fictional cults feel authentic, because they're extrapolating from actual cult structures that predate and surround his work. Psychology scholarship explores why cosmic indifference proves more disturbing than active malevolence. Terror management theory suggests humans maintain psychological stability by believing existence has meaning, that death isn't absolute annihilation, that individual lives matter in some cosmic ledger. Lovecraft's cults directly assault these comforting fictions. Worshipping indifferent entities forces confrontation with meaninglessness while maintaining religious structure. You perform devotions knowing they're futile. You seek knowledge knowing it destroys comprehension. You await transformation, knowing it means your obsolescence. This creates cognitive dissonance that most psychology assumes would be unsustainable. Yet the fictional cults sustain it, suggesting human consciousness might be more flexible or more masochistic than protective models predict. Anthropology has used Lovecraft's cults as thought experiments. If we encountered genuinely alien intelligence, whether extraterrestrial, artificial, or transdimensional, how would religious responses form? Lovecraft's cults provide speculative framework, worship emerging not from misunderstanding, but from accurate perception of radical difference, devotion organized around entities that violate all assumptions evolved religion makes. This treats the fiction as predictive model. When humanity eventually contacts intelligence that doesn't share our evolutionary history, our cognitive architecture, our scales of concern, the religious responses might resemble Lovecraftian cults more than they resemble existing interfaith dialogue. We might discover our theologies were all provincial, addressing human-scaled concerns, unprepared for consciousnesses operating in registers we lack organs to perceive. Critical race theory has necessarily confronted Lovecraft's racism and how it infected his cult portrayals. The mongrel cultists, the association of non-white populations with spiritual corruption, the xenophobia that treats foreign as synonymous with dangerous. These aren't incidental texture, but foundational to how Lovecraft's horror operates. The cults are scary, partly because they're racially other. Decontaminating cosmic horror from xenophobic horror requires deliberate effort. Contemporary authors writing in Lovecraftian tradition must actively separate the philosophical insight, cosmic indifference is horrifying, from the racist implementation, and that indifference comes through non-white populations. This critical work demonstrates the ideas can survive separation from their original context, but that separation requires acknowledging how thoroughly racism shaped the original formulation. Posthumanist philosophy has found Lovecraft's cults strangely relevant. If consciousness isn't uniquely human, if intelligence exists in forms we don't recognize, if our perceptual and cognitive frameworks represent evolutionary accident rather than reality structure, then encountering genuine alterity would produce experiences Lovecraft's cults prefigure. The cults worship what they cannot comprehend using categories that don't apply. This might describe our future relationship to artificial superintelligence, to enhanced cognition, to any consciousness operating at scales or in dimensions our neurology wasn't designed to access. Lovecraft's horror becomes predictive. We're building entities we'll need to relate to somehow, and worship despite incomprehension might be psychologically easier than acknowledging we've created something that renders us obsolete. The academic and subcultural appropriations demonstrate these cults function across contexts because they're addressing perennial concerns. How do we organize meaning when meaning seems absent? How do we form community around truths that isolate? How do we practice devotion when devotion appears futile? Lovecraft provided one set of answers through fictional cults. These answers have proven durable enough that people now use them seriously, magically, philosophically, psychologically, despite knowing their origin in pulp fiction. The boundary between useful fiction and legitimate theology proves more porous than either religious believers or skeptical rationalists find comfortable. Lovecraft's cults exist in that porous space, functioning simultaneously as literature, folklore, philosophy, and for some practitioners, genuine religious framework. The ambiguity itself might be the most authentically Lovecraftian element. You can never be entirely certain whether you're playing with ideas or being played by them. Why worship indifferent gods proves uniquely disturbing, requires examining what traditional religion provides psychologically. Monotheistic traditions offer covenant. God cares about human behavior, responds to prayer, maintains moral order. Eastern traditions offer karma. Actions carry consequences. Justice operates across lifetimes. Suffering has purpose. Even polytheistic and animist frameworks presume spirit world notices human activity, that offerings matter, that relationship exists. Lovecraft's cults systematically remove every comfort while maintaining religious structure. You perform rituals knowing they're unnoticed. You pursue knowledge knowing it destroys. You await divine return knowing it means your irrelevance. This creates theological despair, devotion stripped of reciprocity, worship directed into void that doesn't acknowledge the worship occurred. The futility built into devotion itself generates horror more effectively than traditional. Supernatural threats. Demons can be exorcised. Evil gods can be opposed. Even Lovecraft's great old ones can be temporarily defeated, as the Dunwich Horror demonstrates. But cosmic indifference admits no victory. Stopping Cthulhu's awakening merely delays inevitable stellar alignment. Banishing Yog-Sothoth's spawn doesn't close the gates permanently. The entities aren't attacking. They're existing according to parameters that render human resistance statistically insignificant. The cults recognize this. Their worship represents acceptance of futility as theological principle. This makes them philosophically consistent in ways traditional religion cannot match. They've eliminated the comforting lie that devotion matters to what you're devoted to. Modern resonance emerges through multiple channels, beginning with climate anxiety. The outer gods serve as metaphor for ecological collapse, vast, indifferent, operating on scales that make individual human action meaningless, while collective human action comes too late. We worship carbon economy knowing it's destroying habitability. We perform recycling rituals knowing they're cosmically inadequate. We await tipping points knowing they render our civilization temporary. The cult structure maps perfectly. Hierarchical knowledge, scientists understand, public remains partially ignorant. Feudal practices, individual carbon reduction while systems continue unchanged. Waiting for return, feedback loops activating, ice sheets collapsing, transformation becoming inevitable. We're living inside cult narrative where the entity we're serving is atmospheric chemistry, indifferent to whether we understand the math. Technological acceleration provides another vector. Artificial intelligence development proceeds with cultish characteristics. Prophets, researchers, promising transformation, critics warning of existential risk, public oscillating between denial and apocalyptic acceptance, everyone acknowledging they cannot stop the trajectory. We're building entities we cannot fully comprehend, control, or predict. The worship here is investment, research funding, cultural fascination with what these systems might become. The indifference is structural. Neural networks don't care about human values unless specifically trained to approximate caring, and that approximation might be performance rather than genuine alignment. We're in early stages of potential Lovecraftian scenario, creating intelligence that might render human consciousness obsolete, knowing this possibility, funding development anyway, because not developing it means someone else will. Information overload creates epistemological conditions Lovecraft's cults prefigure. Forbidden knowledge was elite problem when texts were rare, literacy limited, libraries restricted. Now everyone carries devices providing instant access to more information than consciousness can metabolize. The protective ignorance Lovecraft described, the inability of the human mind to correlate all its contents, no longer operates as buffer. We can correlate. The correlation produces understanding that psychological architecture wasn't designed to accommodate. QAnon and similar movements demonstrate cult formation around information excess. Pattern-seeking minds connecting fragments into cosmologies that make emotional sense while violating consensus reality. The structure is Lovecraftian, hidden knowledge, initiated community, transformation awaiting, reality revealed as conspiracy, but applied to political rather than cosmic horror. Conspiracy culture generally operates as Lovecraft's cults translated into social media age. The deep state, the cabal, the shadowy controllers, these function as great old ones by other names. Hidden entities manipulating reality, truth suppressed from public knowledge, initiation through research, leading to gnosis that separates you from normies who remain comfortably ignorant. The psychological appeal is identical. You've seen behind the veil, you possess knowledge that makes you special while isolating you socially. You're waiting for a reveal that will prove you were right, even as normality makes your beliefs seem delusional. The difference is traditional conspiracy theories eventually propose solutions. Expose the conspiracy, defeat the cabal. Full Lovecraftian acceptance would mean recognizing the controllers are undefeatable, possibly unaware of you entirely, rendering your opposition futile. Some conspiracy movements approach this nihilism. Everything is controlled. Resistance is impossible. You can only watch inevitable unfold. Deep fakes and reality collapse bring Lovecraft's dream reality ambiguity into technological instantiation. When any video can be fabricated, any audio synthesized, any text generated by models indistinguishable from human writers, consensus reality requires trust that evidence isn't systematically falsified. This trust erodes daily. We're approaching epistemological situation where verification becomes impossible, not for lack of technical capacity, but because the verification tools themselves might be compromised. Lovecraft's cultists experience this as madness, reality behaving inconsistently, perceptions unreliable, no stable framework for determining truth. We're engineering this condition deliberately through technologies that make fabrication indistinguishable from documentation. The cult of AI might be less about worshiping the systems than about accepting we're entering reality state where human perception cannot reliably determine what's real. The mimetic power of cosmic indifference as philosophical position has proven remarkably durable. Nihilism isn't new. Philosophers from Schopenhauer through Nietzsche through Camus addressed meaninglessness. But Lovecraft provided narrative framework, meaninglessness personified as entities, organized into cults, practiced as religion. This makes the philosophy visceral rather than abstract. You're not considering whether life has meaning. You're imagining what worship looks like when directed at forces that render the question meaningless. This narrative packaging has allowed cosmic indifference to spread through horror fiction, gaming, online communities, becoming familiar idea to populations who never read philosophy but encountered Cthulhu through cultural osmosis. The comfort of meaninglessness for some represents paradoxical appeal. If nothing matters cosmically, then human-scaled concerns can be taken seriously or dismissed according to personal preference. You're liberated from cosmic responsibility. Your failures don't register. Your successes equally temporary. This can produce either paralysis or strange freedom. If it's all futile anyway, you might as well do what you want. The cultists who accept cosmic indifference completely often display this liberation. They're not trying to earn salvation, impress gods, or build legacy. They're participating in temporary reality, aware of its temporariness, finding whatever meaning they can construct, knowing construction is all that's possible. This is Camus's Sisyphus, choosing to enjoy pushing the boulder, applied to cosmic horror framework. The horror of meaninglessness for others creates opposite reaction, desperate reassertion that significance exists, that individual consciousness matters, that human activity carries weight. Lovecraft's cults threaten this reassertion constantly. They're evidence that meaninglessness is not only possible, but might be accurate. The cultists have accepted what you're trying to deny. They've looked at cosmic scale and drawn uncomfortable conclusions. Their existence in fiction, and increasingly in actual practice, suggests the position is sustainable, that human psychology can accommodate truths we assume would be unbearable. This makes them disturbing beyond their narrative function. They prove that acceptance of cosmic indifference doesn't require psychosis, might be achieved through clear seeing rather than delusion. What the cults represent psychologically finally crystallizes: projection of our fear that we're not cosmically significant, organized into religious structure as coping mechanism. We need meaning, we seek patterns, we construct theologies. But what if the most honest theology acknowledges that the universe doesn't provide meaning, doesn't operate according to human recognizable purposes, doesn't notice whether consciousness briefly flourishes before entropy reclaims the materials? The Lovecraftian cult is that honest theology enacted. Cultists worship anyway, not because it matters to the entities, but because worship might matter to the worshippers. The ritual provides structure. The community provides meaning. The knowledge, even when it destroys, feels more authentic than comfortable ignorance. The temptation of giving up agency to vast forces operates throughout these cult structures. Individual human decisions feel overwhelmingly burdensome when you believe you're responsible for constructing meaning in meaningless universe. Lovecraft's cults offer escape. The decisions are already made by cosmic forces beyond your influence. You're not responsible for creating meaning. You're responsible only for recognizing meaninglessness. This relieves existential anxiety while producing different anxiety. If you're not responsible, you're also not in control. The cult framework trades freedom for structure, agency for acceptance. Many traditional religions offer similar trade. Lovecraft's innovation was offering it without comfort. You get structure, but the structure acknowledges your insignificance. You get acceptance, but what you're accepting is futility. Religious impulse, meeting cosmological scale, produces Lovecraft's cults inevitably. If humans are pattern-seeking consciousness that evolved to create meaning in local environment, then encountering genuine cosmic scale should produce cognitive strain. The universe operates at temporal and spatial scales human cognition isn't designed to process. Billions of years, billions of light years, probabilities expressed in numbers that exceed human numerical intuition. Religious impulse tries to make this comprehensible by personifying it, creating entities with agency, purpose, personality. Lovecraft's entities subvert this by being personified, but lacking person-like qualities. They have names, locations, even described appearances, but they don't think like persons, don't care like persons, don't interact according to social primate expectations. The cults worship them anyway because worship is what consciousness does when encountering vast forces it cannot control or comprehend. The unanswerable questions linger beyond the analysis. Would genuine contact with cosmic entities create cults inevitably? Perhaps consciousness encountering true alterity, intelligence that doesn't share evolutionary history, doesn't process reality through similar cognitive architecture, would generate Lovecraftian responses naturally. The worship wouldn't be superstition, but acknowledgement. This exists. It's beyond my comprehension. I'll organize my response to it somehow. Worship is available framework. Is pattern-seeking consciousness cursed to create meaning where none exists? The cultists in Lovecraft's stories might represent endpoint of this tendency. They've recognized patterns, astronomical cycles, dimensional topology, entity behaviors, imposed meaning, worship, ritual, theology, and discovered the meaning doesn't map to reality in ways that provide traditional religious comfort. But they maintain the structure anyway because abandoning it would mean admitting consciousness itself might be tragic joke. Self-aware matter briefly capable of asking why it exists, receiving no answer, dissolving back into matter. Do we worship outer gods by trying to understand universe at all? This is the question Lovecraft's work never quite asks explicitly, but implies constantly. Scientific inquiry, philosophical investigation, artistic exploration of consciousness all involve pushing against limits of what minds can accommodate. Understanding cosmology requires accepting scales that make human concerns microscopic. Understanding consciousness requires accepting that subjective experience might be accidental byproduct of physical processes. Understanding anything deeply enough reveals the provisional nature of all meaning. The cultists are people who pursued understanding and discovered what it cost. Are scientists, philosophers, artists engaging in similar cult behavior, pursuing knowledge despite recognizing it might undermine the very framework that makes pursuing knowledge feel meaningful? Has our technology become the indifferent god? This is perhaps the most practically relevant question Lovecraft's cults pose for contemporary life. We've created systems, economic, technological, bureaucratic, that operate according to logics that don't prioritize human flourishing. Market mechanisms, algorithmic recommendations, institutional procedures function indifferently to individual human welfare, while everyone participates in maintaining them. We worship at altars of economic growth, technological progress, systemic efficiency. The systems don't care about us personally. They process us according to parameters that make local sense, while possibly producing global catastrophe. We're cultists of our own creation, serving entities we built but can no longer fully control, waiting to see whether the transformation they're producing will be transcendence or extinction, or something we lack categories to describe. The lasting philosophical weight emerges from recognizing Lovecraft created cults that can't provide what religious worship traditionally offers, but nonetheless function as worship. They're theologically honest in ways traditional religion cannot match. They acknowledge that devotion might be futile, that meaning might be constructed rather than discovered, that cosmic scale might render human concerns insignificant. This honesty proves disturbing because it removes protective fictions most people rely on for psychological stability. The cultists in Lovecraft's fiction, and increasingly in reality, have accepted these uncomfortable truths and continued living anyway. They've found ways to construct meaning knowing meaning is constructed, to worship knowing worship isn't reciprocated, to await transformation knowing transformation might mean their extinction. The disturbing thought lingers. This might be closer to reality than comforting alternatives. If universe is materialist process without inherent purpose, if consciousness is local phenomenon without cosmic significance, if meaning exists only where minds create it temporarily, before entropy reclaims the materials, then Lovecraft's theology might be more accurate than traditions offering salvation, reincarnation, or moral order. The cultists might be the honest ones. They've looked at existence without protective filters and organized their response accordingly. That their response looks like madness or nihilism or dangerous religious extremism might say more about our psychological needs than about cosmic truth. The lasting mark Lovecraft's cults have left on horror fiction and broader culture is this. Once you've considered cosmic indifference seriously, it becomes difficult to unconsidered. The idea contaminates. You can return to traditional religious comfort, but you'll know it's comfort you've chosen rather than truth you've discovered. You can embrace humanistic meaning-making, but you'll know the meanings you're making have no cosmic authority. You can live as though your actions matter, but you'll know matter means something different at universal scale than at human scale. The cults represent people who've been contaminated by these ideas and organize their contamination into religious structure. They're not warning against something external. They're embodying something internal to consciousness itself. The capacity to recognize our own cosmic insignificance and the desperate need to create meaning anyway, even when, especially when, that meaning requires worshiping forces that render worship meaningless. That's the forbidden knowledge at the center of every cult in Lovecraft's mythology. And once you've understood it clearly enough, you discover you cannot close the book and pretend you didn't read it. The contamination is permanent. You're marked by ideas you cannot unthink, which means, in some sense, you've already joined the cult simply by understanding what the cult understands. The initiation was reading this far. There's no ritual to uninitiate you. Welcome to Cosmic Horror's central insight. Some knowledge, even fictional knowledge, becomes real through comprehension alone.